A Japanese soldier is sleeping in the Burmese jungle. His boots are still on. His rifle is beside him. He feels safe. Behind him, 100 men. In front of him, barbed wire, and beyond it, silence. He does not know that silence is a lie. He does not know that right now, less than 10 feet from his boots, a man is crawling on his belly through mud and leeches. A man barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, a man the British once dismissed as too small for real soldiering. The soldier stirs. He feels something touch his foot. Just a touch. Feather light. He does not wake. By morning, 3 men in his row will be dead, throats opened in total silence, no gunshot, no scream. And beside each body, a single, curved blade mark. Clean, precise, terrifying. The survivors will not sleep again for days. Not because of what they saw, but because of what they didn't hear. This is the story of the Gurkhas. When Britain first encountered these Nepali hillmen in 1814, they didn't see soldiers. They saw farmers, shepherds, men who barely reached the shoulders of a British grenadier. Recruiting officers laughed at them, called them decorative, said they'd break under real combat pressure within a week. They were wrong. And in the jungles of Burma, in the deserts of North Africa, and in trenches soaked with mud and blood across 2 world wars, the enemy would learn exactly how wrong the British had been. But almost, this weapon of terror was never allowed to exist at all. Burma, 1943, the jungle is not a battlefield. It is a coffin with trees. Visibility is measured in meters, not miles. The air is thick enough to drink. Every step forward sinks a boot into mud that pulls like it wants to keep you. And somewhere, always, the enemy is watching. The Japanese Imperial Army had spent a decade convincing itself of one unshakable truth. They were the superior fighting force in Asia. Their soldiers trained under brutal discipline. Surrender was treated as a fate worse than death. Bayonet charges were doctrine. Fear was something the enemy felt, never something a Japanese soldier admitted to. And for a while, they were right to be confident. British and Commonwealth forces were being pushed back, mile after mile, through Malaya, through Singapore, deep into Burma. Conventional infantry tactics, line formations, daylight advances, textbook maneuvers were failing against an enemy who used the jungle itself as a weapon. Ambushes came from nowhere. Supply lines were cut before soldiers even knew they were under threat. Commanders back in London were desperate. Every week brought new casualty reports. Entire battalions vanishing into green silence, never to radio in again. The jungle didn't care about rank. It didn't care about empire. It swallowed armies whole. What the Allies needed wasn't more men. It wasn't more rifles. It wasn't more artillery. Because artillery couldn't see through triple canopy forest anyway. What they needed was something the Japanese had never trained for. Something that didn't follow the rules of civilized warfare. Something that could move without sound, kill without warning, and vanish before the enemy even understood what had happened. And the answer had already been sitting in the British Army for over 100 years, mostly ignored. The Gurkhas were never supposed to matter this much. When the British East India Company first fought the Kingdom of Gorkha in 1814, they expected an easy war. Instead, they got humiliated. Nepali hill soldiers outnumbered, outgunned, wielding curved blades against modern muskets, fought with a ferocity that stunned British commanders. One British officer wrote that he had never seen men so fearless of death. So the British did what empires do when they can't defeat someone, they recruited them instead. But recruitment didn't mean respect. For over a century, Gurkha regiments were treated as a curiosity, a novelty unit, useful for guard duty, decent in a pinch. But when it came to real strategic planning, the missions that mattered, high command routinely looked past them in favor of proper British regiments. Height became the easiest insult. The average Gurkha stood around 5'3" to 5'6". Next to towering British grenadiers, they looked almost boyish. Officers in London's war rooms, men who had never set foot in a jungle, joked that such small men couldn't possibly carry the weight of modern warfare, literally or figuratively. What those officers didn't understand was this: in a jungle war, height was a liability, not an asset. A smaller frame meant a smaller silhouette, easier to move through thick undergrowth, easier to stay hidden, easier to disappear. And these were not ordinary farmers anymore. Gurkha recruits underwent selection processes so brutal that failure rates exceeded those of many elite Western units. Candidates ran uphill for miles carrying baskets loaded with rocks, weighing more than their own bodies, just to prove they belonged. The men who survived selection didn't complain about the mud. They didn't complain about the leeches, the heat, the exhaustion. They had grown up in the Himalayan foothills, where survival itself was already a daily test. By the time a Gurkha reached the front lines, he wasn't just trained. He was forged. And he carried with him a weapon that British High Command dismissed, at first, as little more than a farming tool. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. It didn't look like a weapon of war. It looked almost primitive. An 18-inch blade, curved forward like a question mark frozen in steel. A wooden handle, sometimes wrapped in leather or bone. No bayonet lug, no trigger, no range. The British called it the Kukri, and when they first saw it up close, many officers genuinely laughed. Compare it, side by side, to a standard-issue British bayonet or combat knife straight. Symmetrical, modern, and the Kukri looked like something a farmer would use to clear brush. Which, in Nepal, it often was. This was, after all, a tool as much as a weapon. Nepali villagers used smaller versions to chop firewood, harvest crops, skin livestock. To European eyes trained on the elegance of rifles and the precision of bayonets, the Kukri seemed unserious, a relic, a cultural souvenir, not a combat instrument. What the doubters failed to understand was physics. A straight blade relies on your arm's strength alone to cut. But a curved blade angled forward, weight concentrated toward the tip turns a simple swing into a chopping force multiplier. The geometry does the work your muscles can't. Every strike lands with the accumulated momentum of the curve itself, not just the swing. In the hands of a trained Gurkha, this farming tool could remove a limb in a single motion. It could open a throat before a single sound escaped it, and crucially, it required no reload, no mechanical failure, no muzzle flash to give away a position in pitch darkness. While Japanese soldiers trained for bayonet charges loud, visible, announced from 100 meters, away the Gurkhas trained for something else entirely. Silence, patience, the ability to close distance without ever being detected until it was already too late. There's a story, still told among veterans of the Burma campaign, of a Gurkha platoon sergeant who went missing during a jungle advance. His officers assumed the worst lost, or worse, deserted. Days later, he reappeared, shaken and desperate to explain himself. He hadn't run. He'd gotten separated, stumbled across an enemy patrol operating behind British lines, and refused to let them report his unit's position. He presented his commanding officers with a sack. Heavy, dripping, inside were 17 severed heads. He hadn't fired a single shot. Stories like this didn't stay contained to one unit. They spread through radio chatter, through prisoner interrogations, through the terrified whispers of Japanese soldiers who had survived an encounter and lived to describe it. And once a story like that starts moving through an army's ranks, it doesn't just describe the enemy anymore. It becomes a ghost story. And ghost stories are far more dangerous than bullets. Fear is a weapon that doesn't need ammunition. And by 1944, the Japanese Imperial Army was running out of ways to defend against it. Japanese military doctrine was built on discipline, honor, and the absolute conviction that death in battle was preferable to retreat or surrender. Soldiers were conditioned to fear dishonor far more than injury. Bayonet training emphasized aggression, charge forward, scream, overwhelm the enemy with sheer ferocity. But that doctrine assumed you could see your enemy coming. The Gurkhas took that assumption and burned it to the ground. Night raids became a signature tactic. Small teams would move into no man's land after dark, slipping past sentries, identifying sleeping enemy positions, and eliminating them in near total silence. Veterans from the Burma campaign describe a chilling technique passed down among the ranks, checking a sleeping soldier's boot laces in the dark. Straight across meant an ally, crossed or absent entirely meant an enemy. What happened next required no permission, no radio call, no hesitation. Japanese soldiers began to dread nightfall itself. Sentries who had once stood confidently at their posts started reporting extreme anxiety during night watch. Some units, according to post-war accounts, began doubling and tripling their guard rotations not because intelligence suggested a larger attack was coming, but because the psychological toll of potentially facing a silent Gurkha raid was breaking morale from within. This is the part standard war reporting always misses. The Kukri's true power was never really about how many men it killed. Plenty of weapons killed more, faster, from further away. Its power was in what it did to the mind of every soldier who hadn't been killed yet. A rifle shot tells you where danger is. You can move, take cover, return fire. But a silent throat cut in the dark tells you nothing, except that danger could be anywhere, at any moment, and you would never see it coming. That uncertainty is far more corrosive to a soldier's nerve than any explosion. Japanese prisoners captured later in the war reportedly expressed something rare for that army open respect bordering on genuine dread when describing encounters with Gurkha units, not because of superior firepower, because of an enemy who seemed to move like smoke and strike like a phantom. At the Battle of Tobruk in North Africa in 1942, Gurkha battalions fighting against German forces earned a similarly fearsome reputation, proof that this wasn't isolated jungle mythology. Wherever Gurkhas fought, the same pattern repeated: initial dismissal from the enemy, followed swiftly by dread. The British, who had once mocked their height and questioned their relevance, now found themselves deploying Gurkha units specifically for the missions no one else wanted, the ones requiring absolute silence, absolute nerve, absolute reliability when failure meant death. The small men from the Himalayan hills had become one of the most feared instruments of psychological warfare of the entire conflict, not because of size, but in spite of it. Not every commander learned this lesson in time. Where Gurkha units were properly deployed and trusted with independent operations, the results were staggering. During the brutal fighting around Imphal-Kohima in 1944, a campaign historians now regard as one of the turning points of the entire Burma theatre, Gurkha riflemen played a decisive role in holding critical defensive positions against relentless Japanese assaults. Riflemen like Lachiman Gurung became legend in these battles. Facing an overwhelming Japanese assault on his forward trench, Gurung continued fighting even after a grenade explosion cost him his hand and left him bleeding from multiple wounds, refusing to abandon his post, holding the line until reinforcements arrived. His trench alone accounted for dozens of enemy dead. Actions like his didn't just win ground. They shattered the morale of Japanese units who had believed they were facing weak, undermanned positions. But contrast that with moments earlier in the war, when arrogance cost lives that silence could have saved. In several early campaigns in Malaya and the opening stages of the Burma retreat, Gurkha units were frequently held back from independent night operations, restricted instead to conventional supporting roles under commanders who still viewed unconventional jungle tactics with suspicion. Some senior officers, trained in the rigid doctrines of European warfare, distrusted tactics that didn't follow textbook formations. They wanted disciplined lines, coordinated advances, predictable movement. The jungle punished that rigidity without mercy. Entire columns were ambushed while moving in conventional daylight formation, visible, audible, predictable, falling into traps that a night-adapted, silent approach unit might have detected or avoided entirely. Casualties in these early campaigns were catastrophic, and post-war analysis has repeatedly pointed to inflexible command doctrine as a major contributing factor to Britain's early defeats in the region. It wasn't that the solution didn't exist. It was that too many men in command chairs simply refused to trust it, until desperation and mounting casualty reports forced their hand. By the time senior commanders like General William Slim fully embraced unconventional jungle warfare, deploying Gurkha and Chindit units for the deep penetration, silence-dependent missions they excelled at, the tide of the Burma campaign began to turn decisively in the Allies' favor. The lesson was written in blood before it was written in strategy manuals. The men everyone had once laughed at held the answer the entire time. It simply took catastrophic loss to make command finally listen. Today, the Gurkhas remain one of the most respected fighting forces on earth, their reputation built in the mud of Burma, the sand of North Africa, and later in conflicts from the Falklands to Afghanistan, has never required exaggeration. The facts alone are enough. Modern recruits still face selection standards so demanding that thousands apply each year for only a handful of places. Young men from the same Himalayan villages, running the same brutal uphill trials their grandfathers once ran, carrying baskets of stone-up mountain paths just to prove they belong to a tradition of unbreakable will, and the kukri, that farming tool the British once dismissed with a laugh, remains standard issue in Gurkha regiments to this day. A living symbol, a blade with 100 years of psychological warfare woven into its curve. Go back, now, to that sleeping soldier in the jungle, the one who felt a feather light touch against his boot, and never woke to understand what it meant. He was not killed by superior firepower. He was not killed by an army twice his size. He was killed by men the British Empire once mocked as too small, too unserious, too primitive to matter in modern warfare. But size was never the measurement that counted in that jungle. Silence was. Nerve was. And somewhere, in the dark, 100 more soldiers just like him lay awake that night, listening for a sound that never came, because they had finally learned what an entire empire had once refused to believe. The men they laughed at had already won the war before the sun came up.